So I am Jed Cohen from the Energy Institute at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Austria, here today representing the ECHOS project and also the Smarties project, which will be the next one. Both of these projects are coordinated by NTNU in Norway and specifically Christian Klockner. Starting with ECHOS, just to give you a very brief framework of what the project tried to do. The key research topic here was to look at energy choices and behaviors of individuals as parts of collectives. So really trying to understand how people work together in social groups and different levels of collectives to make energy decisions. The research profile of the project was strongly interdisciplinary. We have scientists from perhaps every social science discipline represented, as well as engineers, as Tina just mentioned, and myself, an economist and data scientist. And the other thing to note about ECHOS is we have a lot of data collection that was done in the project that's now all available via the ECHOS database that Tina will introduce in a moment. And these data collections include interviews, focus groups, international survey across 31 European nations. So in the moments that I have, I want to sort of generalize what we learned from all of these data collections and this interdisciplinary effort that we went through. And as we look through all the different things that ECHOS did and try to think about the policy relevance of these things, three takeaways popped out to us that kept occurring over and over again. And these are our recommendations for how to improve participation in and the impact of energy programs. So specifically how to get consumers and stakeholders more involved. And I will just show you this as well. We have the policy brief that gives a little bit more information out there, which will also show you where you can find links to the full reports and specific recommendations, etc. So going through these quickly, the first one is to reduce the regulatory, legal, and procedural burdens for joining in energy programs and or offer support in navigating, applying for, and interacting with the programs. And what we saw across many of the things that we did in ECHOS is that people were interested in joining in a new energy program or changing their energy behavior, but for a lot of reasons they were confronted with a stack of paperwork when they tried to do that, and this would scare them away. And this was also the case for groups, even corporations, etc. And the other issue here is regulatory and legal risk, that if you take some new action, you might open yourself up to a new legal reaction against you, which a lot of people don't want to deal with. And then the other problem is regulatory risk, meaning that regulation can change, subsidies can change, and this risk will deter people from engaging with energy programs. The second one that Tina will touch on in a moment is to build into energy programs standardized information collection and KPIs. And the important thing is how you present this information to people. There's been a lot of work in social science in general and also in ECHOS of how to show people information about their energy use. And what we see is that based on how you show this information to people, you can get anything from a negative effect on people's behavior in terms of saving energy to zero effect to a strongly positive effect. So how you show the information is just as important as making sure that this information is actually available. And the third thing is to target policies toward collectives and groups of individuals with similar needs and characteristics. This is probably admittedly something that is more relevant for local and regional governments. We'll just touch on it briefly here. But the idea in ECHOS is that we see different groups of people, both across European nations and within European nations, are driven by very, very different motivations and different ways of making their energy decisions. And so if we want to activate all people, trying to use the same approach will not work over a large group. So we suggest to take a targeted approach and target specific groups. So looking at an example of ECHOS research that has to do with that first point I raised, which is to reduce the regulatory and procedural burdens or offer support for them. One of the ways that we came to this conclusion, and this is an economics example, I must say, is that we did a survey of 18,000 Europeans and asked them if they were interested in investing in a wind energy community. The first result here is that 79% of respondents chose to invest in at least one of the options, which shows that there is a lot of interest in this from a hypothetical perspective. The second takeaway here is that people across the EU strongly preferred a community-owned legal entity as opposed to a utility-owned entity or one that was run by the government. So what this means is that people would be much more willing to join in one of these energy communities if there's an energy cooperative that's run by a local NGO that's behind it. We did a social simulation of these data, and we found that across the EU 28, what we call the social potential to invest, or the amount of money that we think is reasonable that could be raised from wind energy communities, is 176 billion euros, and this has a time frame of about the next 10 years. Sensitivity analysis on this puts this estimate between 150 billion and 226 billion euros. Just to put that into perspective, this 176 billion is about half of what we think is needed to be invested directly into new renewable energy capacity by 2030 to reach the targets. So we do think that this idea of community energy can have a strong impact. What's the policy relevance here? Well, first of all, this social potential that we see can be interpreted as investments that come from the RED and ED2 packages, and also this idea can give some idea of how these directives can best be unleashed. Secondly, European Commission funded initiatives like Res Co-op, which focuses on getting these energy communities up and running, have done really well in some countries like Denmark and Germany, but we think that more action is needed to develop these in other countries because we see that there's a lot of interest across Europe, and specifically to develop the operational capacity of local actors and NGOs who would be willing to fill the role of a community-owned legal energy community. Now I will hand to Tina.
Working? One of the targets of the ECHOS project was also to support the set plan implementation. And one of the tasks was also we were looking at how the set plan different actions consider SSH as a whole. And especially in the set plan action 3.1, there has been created a draft list of key performance indicators, how to monitor citizen involvement in energy transition, also the benefits, and also aspects, what kind of negative impacts the energy transition could have. So the recommendation about build into energy programs, standardized information and data collection tools, and monitor the developments with selected key performance indicators, including indicators for social effects. So in the ECHOS project, we, like I mentioned, went through all the indicators which were proposed by the set plan 3.1 for energy consumers, and then also we're looking at the indicators related to energy poverty, and also suggested some new indicators. As an example, how the vulnerable households could, what kind of impacts about the climate change could be. So not only the heating, but also for the cooling, as an example. And we recognize that, in fact, that there are still way to go. So there are some data available, but a lot of data is probably not very transparent. It's not collected continuously. So there are still things to do, how to really monitor citizens' engagement and so on. So really to ensure that this kind of information is available, both for the individuals and also the actors, in a way that allows us to understand our energy use and how it relates to the usage of others and market environment factors. So there is one report related to the key performance indicators. It's now in the ECHOS websites. And then what already was mentioned by Jed, that there's a huge amount of new data. So SSH related data for clean energy transition. All the data which was created by the ECHOS project in addition to some additional data, which is publicly available. Some examples of the key performance indicators. They are now available for open access database. There are different tools how you are really able to compare different EU member states. So this is just an example, how does it look like. So there's this graphical maps, different kind of indicators. This is just an example about energy transition, how the attitudes and lifestyles are varying across different EU countries. So the database includes all the EU member states, plus Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, and so on. So it's worth of checking. How does it look like? We will be also happy to receive any feedback if you find some challenges going around. But now it's just a big thing that we have the data. So the next thing that we are looking for is that how we will utilize the data. But this is now the opportunity for us.
Okay, thank you, Tina. So just one more slide that touches on that third point from our policy brief, which is to target policies towards specific groups. As I said, I think this is most relevant at the regional or local level. Just to give you one idea of where we see that in the data, also from this survey of 18,000 Europeans, we had a built-in experiment in the survey where each person was given €5 for their participation so that we get a good survey sample. And then afterwards, they were offered the opportunity to basically put their money where their mouth is in a lot of cases and buy carbon offsets with those €5. So this is then a real-life experiment where we actually observe people making a choice with their euros. What we see from the results is that people are driven by largely different concerns. One is that climate change beliefs, or more specifically not believing in climate change, there's a group that very strongly will definitely not move to support any climate action based on this belief. Another one is local benefits as drivers for donation. So if people think that their donation or the energy transition in general and a low carbon society will create jobs and reduce local pollution so that they have sort of a local benefit to themselves and their families, this is one group. And then again, identifying as an environmentalist, having this self-view and wanting to be a part of this environmentalist movement is another very strong driver. So we can see just from those three groups that each of those three groups of people will have very different levers in terms of how to access them with a policy or what they might be interested in getting involved in. And so the idea here is that to sort of collate these levers, and we've done this in ECHO's report 7.3, but to put these together to give policymakers an idea of which levers they can use to access different target groups. We think that this also relates to the EU climate laws as well. So that's ECHO's. Thank you very much. There's more information in the policy brief, again outside and also on the website. Shall I just continue?
Well, let's see if there are any questions. That was quite